It's always a pleasure to engage in conversation with colleagues in Catholic education. When I was living in Colombia, as a matter of fact, I worked for the organization that was the equivalent to NCEA in the United States. And part of my job was to go around the country and train religious education, actually religion teachers, in different places. In many countries in South America, Central America, religion can be taught in public schools. So that's why the job was huge. There are about 3,000 Catholic schools in, 300 Catholic schools in the central part of Colombia. And also you have thousands of public schools where religion is being taught. So my first moments in the world of Catholic education began there. Then coming to the United States, teaching primarily at the college level, has always been a pleasure and a good connection in terms of the world of Catholic education. So when I received the invitation to engage in dialogue with you, I consulted with one of my colleagues, with Professor Thomas Groom, and as I discerned, accepting the invitation, what really made me, or what made this a very appealing opportunity is the fact of your commitment to theology, to religious education, and as Brother Ernest was saying, to evangelization. And I think that the topic that we will be discussing over the next few hours is a topic that actually fits right in to this reality. Cultural diversity, multiculturalism, and how, as religious educators, as theologians, teachers of theology, administrators in campus ministry, and so forth, we create the conditions in our schools, in our own contexts, for not only our students to understand the reality of the church in the United States, but at the same time, for us to be bridges, that open the structures of our own schools to actually meet the needs and respond to the needs of the larger church in the United States. So this is what I propose for us to begin doing tonight. Instead of looking at this as three completely different and separate sessions, I think it's best to look at this as one conversation in 3 moments, And we will be retaking some of the ideas from the previous conversation and then start building on it. So for tonight, this is what we'll begin doing. We'll start with the question of diversity. I think that's the best way for us to begin our dialogue. What is diversity, and why do we need to pay attention to diversity? And this is something that's going to shape a lot of our conversations between today and tomorrow. Then I want to frame this conversation in the context of a number of paradigm shifts that are taking place, actually, or have already taken place in the United States of America, and that are shaping not only Catholic education, but also shaping the way ministry is being done, shaping the way we understand ourselves as Catholics in this particular culture. Thirdly, I just want to give you an overview of what U.S. Catholicism is about in terms of demographics. I think that when we compare the larger demographics in the life of the church to the demographics of what's happening or what's in our own schools, then some reflections, I think, are necessary. And finally, I'll just begin the conversation that we'll develop tomorrow, which is the whole idea of cultural competencies. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops has invited the whole church in this country, particularly those working at the level of education and ministry, to remain attentive to cultural competencies. Why? Because the cultural diversity within which we live calls for a different way sometimes of doing what we do, teaching, ministering, serving, and so forth. So these will be the four main topics that we'll have today. And let's begin with actually a note on our method of inquiry. I want to use for this, for our conversation, or at least for you to have an idea of how I'm moving with my presentations, is the method that I invite you to keep in mind. On the one hand, it's a method that has worked, is very popular in Latin America. It's popular also in the United States, and it's been a method that has been very traditional to the life of the church. And it's the see, judge, act methodology. It's very simple, it's very accessible, but at the same time, it's effective because it allows us to begin with reality. So theologians like Ignacio Yacuría from El Salvador, a Jesuit, and John Sobrino as well, they make emphasis on the fact that in order to begin any form of reflection, whether it's theological or sociological, we must be inserted in reality. We cannot try to understand reality only by looking at it from the outside. We need to be inserted in the context of reality, see it, listen to it, hear it. We need to smell reality and be part of it. Once we look at reality, or we are inserted in that reality, then we will be in a better shape to pass some kind of judgment, whether a critical judgment or a judgment of acceptance. But without that being inserted in that reality, it's very difficult for us actually to make some appropriate judgments. And finally, no reflection will be complete if it does not lead into action. So somehow this is the pattern that we will be using in these reflections over the next few hours. We will begin tonight with a broad overview of reality. Second, tomorrow we'll start analyzing this reality in terms of the idea of cultural diversity. And towards the end of the day, then we'll start looking at what can we do as educators, administrators, campus ministers for our schools and our ministries and our own service to be, and I use constantly two words, responsive and responsible to the idea of, or to the experience of cultural diversity in the church. So let's begin with just a quick question. Briefly, why don't you just take 1 minute and write down in your own words, what is diversity? What is diversity? What would be your response to that particular question? Some dictionaries would define it as the condition of being diverse. I hope that we can go beyond that, Second question, in what ways have you experienced diversity in your own personal and or professional life? Let's see if your definition matches your experience. In what ways have you experienced diversity in your personal and or your professional life? Okay. Who wants to venture into sharing the definition of diversity? What is diversity? Just what you wrote. Differences.
Increasing involvement of members that are considered minority populations, leading to a shift from what we consider the majority.
Numbers and the dynamic minority majority. Thank you. What else is diversity?
Multitude of perspectives based on lived realities.
Multiple or multitude of perspectives based on lived realities. Okay, so when we attempt to define the word, the concept diversity, then we find ourselves that there are many factors influencing this. Whether there is historical factors or cultural, demographics, sometimes gender will have something to say in terms of issues of diversity and so forth. Now, hold on to the other question and we'll get back to it at some later on. In order to understand diversity, it is important for us to look at different factors that shape that particular condition. I think your definition really captures well what I will be saying in a few minutes. So it's based on the lived condition, on the lived reality of who we are as human beings. So the first aspect that we need to keep in mind as we define diversity is that you and I are historical beings. And we all are shaped by the historical moment within which we live. We all are children of our own time. And sometimes one of the mistakes that we try to make is to live, say, in the 40 years before our own time, or sometimes we want to be ahead of our own times. But as historical beings, we are called to be attentive to the time and space within which we are located. So it might sound a little bit simplistic, but it's very important because diversity, especially when we start looking at the definition of the identity of a school, for instance, or the identity of an institution, diversity will be defined primarily by how that institution understands its own historical position in the here and now of reality. No? So history is one of the first factors. Second, identity. Diversity has to do with who I am, or who am I, or what makes me who I am. Diversity is about personal and communal identity. Those characteristics, those features that invite me to present myself before the world. And with those identities, act in one way or another. No, I, for instance, part of what makes me come in front of this group is my own identity as a professor, for instance. But not only as a professor, I come before you as someone who was born in a different country as an immigrant. Not only that, also as a male person. So there are certain elements that shape who we are, what we do, regardless, and there isn't much choice, in the definition of this aspect. So when we speak of diversity, we must be mindful of the specificity of identity. Why? Because constantly, when we are developing or building structures in society, when we are building in community, there are tendencies to homogenize those institutions or the vision of a particular school or the vision for a particular organization. But it's important for us to see what are the elements of identity that shape the lives of a particular community. 3, diversity deals or has to do with social location. Where am I in regard to others? As human beings, we are constantly in relationship with other people, with others like us. So how I relate to the other or to others will shape my understanding also of reality and the decisions that I make. No? If, for instance, I decide that I cannot relate to the other because of difference in genders or race or language or ideology, therefore, that sets us apart. And that shapes the reality of a particular interaction that we could have in society. So diversity is important. No? As social location is important as to how we decide to, interact with the other. That's the active dimension. But on the other hand, we also need to recognize that oftentimes we do not choose our social location. So oftentimes we are just born into a particular social location. So often we are shaped by a specific social location, and of course we have chances to change that at some point, but there are many people who do not. There are many people who do not. No? So it depends on the culture within which we live and the socio-historical circumstances within which we are inserted to be able to react to this social occasion. Fourth, diversity has to do with choices, which connects to what I was saying. Diversity deals with the fact that we have the opportunity to decide to remain in one place under certain set of circumstances and change them if we can. Not all the time we can change our circumstances. Not all the time we can change them. But as human beings, in principle, we have the liberty to do that. And by choosing X, Y, or Z path, we have the opportunity to engage, actually embrace diversity or reject it. No? Our own choices may create a condition for diversity or may simply ignore it or reject it. I'll give you one example. The United States of America in the 21st century is more segregated racially than it was in the 1930s. 1930s, there were segregation laws that made diversity, or at least the integration of society, more difficult. In the 21st century, segregation does not come by legislation. Segregation is mostly by choice. So choice is very important. Personal choice is an important aspect as to how we deal with diversity. Whether we choose to live it, reject it, or we choose to embrace it and do something about it. So one of the points that I will develop tomorrow, and we will discuss in detail, is the idea of diversity as a problem or as a gift. No? And that's an important question that we need to ask, because that's going to shape, and particularly for most of you as educators, for most of us as educators, it shapes, for instance, the way we choose our curriculum. No? If we see diversity as a problem, therefore, our curricular decisions will shy away from diversity. No? Look at what's going on in Arizona, for instance. No more Mexican or Chicano study programs. That we don't have to do that. So let's try to do the more central, homogeneous kind of curriculum. Or let's try to to make a conscious choice and see how one can change reality to respond to those elements of reality that are dictating the direction in which one institution could go or not. And finally, in order to understand diversity, and I think that this word actually captures the other four concepts, is the idea of context. Context is important. Context matters. For context, I mean those circumstances that surround my own being personally and communally. In other words, no human being, no community, no school, no group of students operates in neutral ground. It is impossible. There is not such a thing as a neutral ground in which we will say, when I come into this place, we are going to suspend all our ideological positions. I'm going to suspend all my historical background, my identity, and then let's try to be friends or enemies. There's not such a thing, you know? Even when we go to church for Mass, no? The fact that we are celebrating the Mass as one church, as one community, does not mean that I stop being who I am, whether for good or for bad. So context is always important because in a sense, in a very Heideggerian sense, you know, we are thrown into a particular reality. This is the world within which we are called to live, no? This is the reality within which we are, and that particular context shapes our language. It shapes the way we see the world. It shapes the way we interact with one another. One interesting example, you know, a friend of mine, priest from Mexico, comes to work in the United States, and the whole idea of physical contact in the North American culture is very interesting, you know, particularly for someone born outside of the United States. But in Latin America, in Mexico, this priest, you know, the whole idea of physical contact, hugging, holding hands, physical contact is part of the culture. He comes to the United States, and the first thing his bishop tells him is, you cannot touch people, particularly children, you know? You cannot, can I hug them? No. Hold hands? Maybe, you know? But that's how context shapes behaviors. That's how context shapes reality. And all of this together, history, identity, social location, choices, context, all of that is what we could call, in one word, culture. All of these elements constitute culture. Now, it would be ideal that there existed only one culture. We could say, sure, okay, let's try to figure out our own history, our common identity, our common social location, and our choices in our context, and then call this the American culture. It would be ideal to do that. But what about when there are many histories going on at the same time happening? We have the history of African Americans on the one hand, very different from the history of Latinos, Latinas, very different from the history of the Irish, or white Catholics, or white Americans. Different histories coexisting, different social locations. We have people who live in extreme poverty, and we have people who are extremely wealthy. Different social locations, different choices. People who choose to go to school, go to college, work hard, and people who choose to do otherwise. So when you have this multiplicity of factors being multiplied at the same time into different realities and moving in different directions, then that's what we call a multicultural reality, or a pluralistic reality. Is this something new? No. As a matter of fact, this is human experience. This is reality. This is who we are from the beginning. It's always been like this. But throughout history, different societies have tried to deal with diversity in different ways. Nazi Germany, for instance, tried to deal with diversity in a horrible way. No? There are societies that have tried to embrace diversity and see what works best. So every time we deal with diversity, we need to negotiate. Look at what's going on in terms of immigration in the United States. You know, sometimes we hear horror cases. Sometimes we hear positive cases, situations. However, the United States still, among the first world nations, one of the nations that best handles integration of different cultures. This is what we are. When we compare this, I mean, despite its limitations, but look at what's going on, for instance, in Germany. Look at what's going on in Spain or in other parts of Europe, or what's going on in South Africa. So how do we, each society needs to deal with diversity and negotiate. But in order to negotiate diversity, one must know the reality, and we need to know it well. We need to know our history. Let's see. We need to know our history. We need to know who we are. We need to know where we stand as an institution. We need to know what are our choices, and we need to understand our context. In other words, we need to understand the multiplicity of cultures that coexist in our own reality. Catholic schools are not neutral ground. Neither are churches, nor parks, or malls, commercial centers, or anything else. Everything is always shaped by this particular diversity. And how we teach, for instance, how we develop curriculum, how we do campus ministry, when we make decisions about enrollment in our institutions. I will get to that particular point, because Catholic schools can do much, much more in terms of enrollment to address this particular issue of diversity. I know that most of you perhaps don't have a say in this regard, but you can become voices to raise consciousness, because we want to respond to this reality. So let me just go into a number of paradigm shifts that I believe are helping us today to deal with diversity in a much better way. Now, as I was saying, the idea of diversity is not new. It's always been part of our reality, of our human experience. But what's different for us today, 21st century, United States of America, is that in many ways, there have been a number of factors that came together and have led us into a better appreciation of diversity. Now, we need to know these factors to see how we can use them to our benefit, and then somehow develop structures that respond adequately to diversity. Today, one of the key elements or the key factors helping us to deal with diversity is the issue of historical and critical consciousness. In a nutshell, historical consciousness basically has to do with the fact that we know that we are inserted in the context of history, and that history changes. That history always brings us something new, and that there isn't just one history, but history is, or actually that history unfolds in different ways depending on the socio-historical reality of a particular community. And we are aware of that. And because we are aware of that, we are able to pass judgment on history. How we have treated women, for instance. In some cultures, we could go to a culture in the East, for instance, or sometimes in Latin America, And we can easily hear the argument, this has always been the case. You know, this is how we have treated women. This is how we have treated people of color. This is the way how we have treated immigrants. This is who we are. But because of historical and critical consciousness, now we are able to say, wait a minute. We can challenge not only what has always been, but also propose new perspectives and new ideas of moving history into a whole different direction. One of the best examples that we have in the United States is the civil rights movement, for instance. No? Historical consciousness, critical consciousness, in which we shape history. We transform the way history can move. The argument of this is we have always done it is always challenged by historical critical consciousness. Second, another factor that has helped particularly Christians and Catholics to deal with diversity and the issues of pluralism is the emergence of a number of theological schools or theological models, methodologies. Some of them, for instance, and I guess that some of you might be already familiar with it, you know, we can say feminist theology, U.S. Latino, Latina Catholic theology, African American Catholic theology, Asian American Catholic theology. We are beginning to see some elements of Native American Catholic theology. I just want to stick to the Catholic world. But it is these movements that somehow have challenged us to say that theology can be done not only in mostly Euro-American or North American ways, or mostly in traditionally neo-scholastic, Thomistic ways of thinking, that there are other ways of embracing methodological assumptions and then reflecting upon the mystery of God in ways that are transforming and raise voices that before were not heard. So these theological movements have raised new awareness. And I think that as many of you here are theology teachers, my sense is that the more we know about these movements, about these theological movements, the better we understand the reality, of our own church, in our own community. Some of you might also be teaching religious studies, and how important, we know a lot about the importance of interreligious dialogue, no? More likely, you are teaching courses that introduce your students to different religions, different Christian denominations. That's fine, you know. And in many of our schools, both Catholic schools, at the high school level and at the college level, are doing an excellent job in that regard. But you know where we are not doing such a good job is in embracing some of these contemporary theological movements. No, sometimes in a lot of the curriculum that we see in colleges, I'm not too familiar with the curriculum in most high schools, but in many colleges you seldom hear about U.S. Latino, Latina theology, or feminist theology, or African American theology, or Asian American theology. However, in a church, you know, in a diverse church like the one in the United States, it's not only advisable, but it is imperative to know this. And when we look at the numbers, I'll confirm why, you know. So the majority of Catholics in the United States, as a matter of fact, are what we would call Catholics, people of color. No? Those are the emerging voices. And the more we know about the theological reflection movements within these groups, the better we will be able to understand that reality. Second Vatican Council, we're celebrating 50 years. I don't have to say much about it, but I think that what Vatican Council did for us in terms of shifting paradigms and raising new awareness was that idea that the church, with all its institutions, has a responsibility to the world within which we live. We are not isolated. We live inserted into that into a particular reality, and within that reality, we are actors. No, are actors. We're not just passive, or we are not living at the margins. We are not hiding from that reality. We are participating into this reality because that reality is ours. What happens in the society is something that happens, is something that in which we are involved. And finally, globalization. Now, through the media, transportation, all what's happening with the internet, the world of technology, we are more aware about a world beyond our own immediacy. We're way aware about this world beyond us, no? So we know that we are not isolated. We know that we are not the center of the world. We know that there are other experiences, there are other realities, other cultures, other perspectives. So these are some important aspects that have shaped the awareness of reality among Catholics over the last, say, 50, 60 years. Now, let's look at three major transitions then in the world of Catholicism. So we are moving primarily from this idea, and again, the 20th century should be for Catholics the century in which this happened. Protestantism went through some of this in the 17th, 18th century, 19th century, a little bit ahead of us. But as Catholics, we have moved more or less, or by and large, from the idea that one size fits all to the idea that there are many sizes. And we see this in the way we educate, in the way we make commitments to ministry, in the way we engage our different realities. Second transition. Actually, let me just say something like this. So we have gone from this idea of Catholicism as a major religion or as the tradition to what Robert Schreider, philosopher, a theologian, actually with whom you will be studying, I'm pretty sure, at CTU in Chicago, says we're moving from the idea of Catholicism to Catholicity. Catholicism meaning universal, to Catholicity meaning, actually, Catholicism universal, the church is everything. We're moving to the idea of Catholicity. Christianity is for everyone. No? So instead of being everything, to being for everyone. Second point, we're moving as a church with all our institutions, including schools, from the idea of mission ad gentes to the idea of mission inter gentes. In other words, we are moving from that idea that we hold the truth, the only truth. And we're moving, and therefore, we holding this only truth, we bring it to others. And Vatican II was very wise, in terms of opening the doors for us to recognizing that there are elements of goodness and truth in every culture, in every religion. So in other words, one of the transitions is that we now engage in dialogue through our institutions, with our resources, with people. We go in conversation with others. Of course, without giving up what we know, what we believe, what we have experienced. However, we also acknowledge that there are elements of truth in other cultures, elements of goodness that we can uphold and value from other cultures. Now, this also, here I'm focusing primarily on the church as a religious institution. But let's try to look at this in terms of ethnicity, for instance, So we have moved from the idea of colonization. In the colonial times, it was these particular bodies, particular societies, name it, Portugal or Spain or England or even the United States, moving from this idea that this is who we are, we bring culture, we bring progress, we bring development, we bring funding into this, and religion to these other communities, these other societies. Now we're shifting, or we have shifted to the idea that we come and it is important to affirm what exists in the other communities. And in a multicultural world, this is a very important take for us. And finally, we have shifted from the idea of beginning with global understandings of culture, church, reality, to local understandings of reality. So, for instance, instead of speaking of American Catholicism, or actually, I think it's better framed as Catholicism in America, we begin to speak about Latina Catholicism in the United States, Asian Catholicism in the United States. We can speak of New England Catholicism in the United States, Southwestern form of Catholicism in the United States. So the transition is that we are more aware about the specificity of culture in the different parts, the different locations of our nation, neighborhoods, schools, and then out of that diversity, we try to come to not much of a consensus, but to the development of a community in which each voice has a place at the table and we respect one another. We respect one another. And this is not easy. This is not easy because we are used to, in many contexts, to bring in the overall idea, the overarching vision. And we all have an overarching vision. I'm pretty sure that LaSallian schools have an overarching vision as well. And we all have them. So it's easier to come with the overarching vision and say this is what all schools should be, or this is what all institutions should be, this is how campus ministry should be. And there is merit there. But on the other hand, there is another movement that needs to happen. And that movement is, what about a LaSallian school in Philadelphia? What kind of culture and what kind of gifts that school brings? And how that school or that system enriches the experience of being Catholic, being LaSallian, when we enter in dialogue with LaSallians from Detroit and then California and so forth. So I think it's important to keep those two realities. Robert Schreider, again, says that perhaps the best way to deal with this reality, this dynamic, is to look at the idea of the glocal. So global and local together, always a dynamic reality. How are we doing so far? Questions, observations, comments, reactions? Yes?
I find a parallel with the political situation around today on your last comment, where like the Northeast is very much in the terminology of the blue states, and then you get other parts of the country, the red states. And sort of, it comes to me that that's a lot of our challenges with coming together, not so much as a church, but politically.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And this reflection, these observations apply literally to the way we understand family, the way we understand politics, the way we understand commitment, the whole idea, for instance, of what it means to be pro-life, or what it means to be, means to do social justice, So all this is shaped by all these dynamics, but again, moving towards one side or the other can be, extremes are always dangerous, Thank you.
Another layer that occurs to me as part of an ongoing conversation in our school is that we have a population of students coming to us
Absolutely, absolutely. And diversity is way beyond language, ethnicity. You know, it's also how we have been exposed to different experiences of being a community of faith. Yes, yes. Brother.
Isn't there a counter-intervening paradigm shift, though, in the church? Which is, I mean, I don't want to raise the issue, but I mean, it is. You know, when you talk Vatican II, when you talk one size fit all, when you talk about mission into gentis, that there's a conflict. It's not a clear thing that a feminist theology, African-American theology are in the movement of being a...
Absolutely. Yeah, and officially we see winds of shifting back somehow, or at least putting the brakes to a lot of these movements, no? I think that the challenge for us is to say how we can remain in dialogue, no, without losing the ground that has been gained. I mean, I think it would be sad if at some point we decided as a Catholic Church to say, we don't want to listen to women theologians anymore. That would be horrible. No, that would be horrible. We don't want to, have our curriculum pay attention to social justice. No, that would be diminishing to the whole idea of Catholic identity. I don't think that we will get to that point, But again, these are winds that go here and there, and the challenge for us in this multicultural world is, how do we deal with them? How do we handle them? At one point, I was at a conference, and somebody asked me, actually, this person was a little bit upset, because Pope Benedict had, this motu proprio saying that we can now celebrate Mass in Latin. So this person was a little bit upset and said, what do you think of that? Now Mass in Latin. And my answer is, why not? Celebrate Mass in Latin, as long as people who want to celebrate Mass in English can do it in English, Now, I guess that a lot of people would be truly upset if it were everybody has to do it in Latin, no? I don't think that we will get to that point. So the openness to diversity needs to be in the minds of those who are more on the progressive side, but also on the conservative side, So I think that extremes are always dangerous. Thank you.
As you go forward, not necessarily to take you off track of where you're going, but you've mentioned curriculum thus far. We're going to have a breakout session with the religion teachers on continuing to look at, how we're moving or not moving, as it might be, with the bishop's curriculum framework. How does what you are putting on the table for our consideration in terms of the diversity and attention to curriculum, how does it fit into this bishop's curriculum framework? Right?
Challenging. What about if we take on that question tomorrow in the third part? Because that's what we'll do tomorrow when we start moving to practical commitments. How to take all this? We'll move into that in the third session. So thank you for that question, and I won't forget it. So we'll get to that. Yes.
I'll just make one observation. You were talking about this kind of Catholic, this kind of Catholic. As a high school religion teacher, I have another kind of Catholic, which is be a nice person Catholic.
Oh, yes. Yes. Thank you for bringing that into the conversation. Absolutely. Yes. Yep. Okay, so turn to context. Now, here I'm speaking to the choir because I know that a lot of you are, this is what we're doing right now, and this is the kind of understanding of Catholic education that we have inherited, at least from the last few decades. So education is more attentive than ever to the idea that it is a process that happens here and now, So education does not happen in the abstract. We are educating young women and men who are flesh and blood people with personal stories, with people with specific realities. They live in specific neighborhoods. They come from different, from families whom we can identify. So the turn to context, invites us to realize, or at least to affirm the idea, that education cannot be completely outrooted from that reality. As a matter of fact, one of the calls for the Catholic school, whether at the high school level or at the college level in higher education, is the fact that the school the Catholic school has a responsibility to the particular social context within which it is inserted. I think that's an important aspect, you know. So I think that it would be limiting. It would be a limited vision to see the Catholic school, at whichever the level we want to think, to see itself as something neutral or uncommitted, isolated from what's going on in its neighborhood. What's going on in its neighborhood. I know of a number of, I could give you a number of examples of, for instance, Catholic schools in, say, cities that are largely migrant or, you know, made up of immigrants, cities that struggle with poverty, but the schools, you know, are mostly populated by middle-class students, Catholic schools. So the question for schools like this is, how can the school look outside its own walls and see the here and now of its own reality and respond to it, or engage it, at least in conversation? 2, in the turn to context, we know that our context is shaped by particular circumstances that are unique. It's not the same to speak of Catholicism in Los Angeles, for instance, where migration, there is large diversity in terms of ethnicity, is something large and very important. It's a topic that's constantly emerging in conversations, as to be, for instance, a Catholic school in Vermont, perhaps in Maine or New Hampshire. So these are different social contexts, but there are particular circumstances. The questions that we might be asking in Vermont are not exactly the same questions that we might be asking in Florida and Miami, for instance, or that we might be asking in Omaha, or we could be asking in Seattle or in California. So particular circumstances. I want to get back to this point. Cuban-American theologian, biblical scholar Fernando Segovia says that that theology is always done with and for, by flesh and blood people. And this is an important aspect that we also need to keep in mind in terms of the educational experience. That the people with whom we are working are people with real lives. And as we are, we have our own limitations and we have our own gifts. The students who come into our school do not come in isolation from their families. They have their own cultures, their own ways of doing things. So tomorrow we'll look into this a little bit more, but one of the challenges, for instance, in the way we offer curriculum or design programs is, how can we capitalize on the cultural background of our students, for instance? How can we capitalize on the different experiences, historical, social, cultural, ethnic, linguistic, of the students and their families for the different programs that we develop and that we have in our institutions. And finally, in context, more often than not, our society is it's a very diverse society. And I'm not defining the diversity only in ethnic or linguistic terms, but that's an important factor. But the fact that we are more aware about, for instance, the students that you describe, so the students who are unchurched, many of the students who come and don't have a very strong experience of parish life. That's a whole culture, That's what, what's his name? Chris Smith called this, what is the ism? The first word that escapes me. Therapeutic deism, So we have students who pretty much, are part of that culture, but we also have very committed Catholic students. I can tell you my experience or what I have seen at Boston College, we see a whole range of students, and I'm pretty sure that you see them as well in your own schools. We have students, Catholic students who can recite the scriptures back and forth, and they are committed evangelizers, and they do Eucharistic adoration, and they are, Catholics, the whole 9 yards. But then there are other Catholics who say, I was baptized Catholic, and yeah, sure, I'm Catholic because my parents are Catholic, So you have all those, all these things, plus the former Catholics as well. So let's see how we're doing. Okay, we're doing fine with time. Changing face of U.S. Catholicism. I'm just bombarding you with information here. I'm giving you concepts, data, but that's the whole idea, We are supposed to do in this first talk an overview, see the reality, what should take us about a whole semester, we have to do it in an hour, but it's fine, we'll try to do our best. So this is the reality. Why do we need to care about diversity in the United States? Well, in the 1950s, 90% of Catholics in the United States were Euro-American, white, 90%, So to speak of Catholicism, American Catholicism, in this country was largely to speak of, the experience of the Germans, the Italians, the immigrants primarily from Western Europe, mostly Caucasian. African American Catholics, just a small group. Latino Catholics, I don't want to get into the history, but Latino Catholics, in the Southwest, particularly Mexican and Mexican Americans, historically were considered like second, third class Catholics. So their experiences didn't count. Just take any church history book, and then they have if they don't have a footnote, then they have one paragraph saying, and by the way, there are Mexican American Catholics down there, there were Mexican American Catholics in the Southwest, but you don't read that much, So Catholicism, historically, in the United States, has been largely defined as Euro-American, Caucasian, or white Catholicism. Nothing wrong with it. But since the 1960s, there has been a major demographic transition that is reshaping the life and the faces, literally the faces of the church, So just to give you an idea, actually, let me just start with some numbers here. Hispanic Catholics, the largest number of Catholics in this country is not Euro-American anymore. As a matter of fact, it's Hispanic. 43% of all Catholics in this country are Latinos, Latinas, And that sometimes is a shocking number for a lot of people, in institutions or in colleges or whatever we are, in the world of theological, in the world of theology as well. So 43% of all Latinos, of all Catholics are Hispanic. But notice this, 55% of all Catholics under the age of 18 are Hispanic. 55%, And that means that in 20 years, when you put these two numbers together, that means that if white Catholics continue to leave the church or stop their identification with the Catholic Church, by 2050, Latinos will constitute about 70% of the Catholic population, okay? Not to say that Latinos are not also leaving the church. That is a major trend. By the second, third generation, Latinos are also stop identifying themselves with the Catholic Church, many of them. Not all of them, but many. So we are shifting quickly to a whole new experience of being Catholic. An experience of being Catholic, if I could say it, a la Latina, So so now you can see it perhaps in some of our schools, 50 years ago, Our Lady of Guadalupe, sure, you knew about her in the Southwest. Now almost everywhere where I go. She's omnipresent, you know. She's the champion, you know. So it's just Our Lady of Guadalupe. Now, 50 years ago, you would ask people, what are las posadas? Most people wouldn't know what las posadas were. Today, you ask any theologian or most Catholics, and people will pretty much tell you, yeah, well, I know what las posadas is, no? In some of these practices. Second largest group, Western European background, 38.8%. Look at the drop from 90 to 38.8% in only 50 years, 50, 60 years. That's dramatic, you know? That's a dramatic drop, no? So, but again, it's not because all Catholics left. Many actually did. And as you know, you were saying in your introduction, pretty much, you know, the second largest denomination, if it were a denomination, would be former Catholics, no? But it's not only that. It's the issue of migration and high birth rate, you know? So migration, 70% of the growth of the Catholic Church since 1990 until today, it's because of Latinos, mostly for those two reasons, migration and birth rate. Let me just give you some numbers. Latinas, on average, have 2.5 children. I don't know how you make the 0.5, but you know, it's just more. But Euro-Americans, on average, have 1.5 children. You know, it's increasing. Did you know, as a matter of fact, this was something that I recently learned from a demographer, that during this time of recession, since 2006 until now, the number of white women have increased the number of children they are having. So it seems like recessions, you know, have a strange effect, you know. But but in any case, Latinas, Asians, no, and Asian women are also having large number of more children than the average population. So this is what's going to cause this shift, you know, dramatic shift, or is causing it in the Catholic Church. Most immigrants from Latin America are Catholic. That's why this is, the immigration from Latin America is really impacting, the idea of Catholic life in this country. Other ethnic background, Catholics of other ethnic background, will be Catholics who are, for instance, from Africa, which are mistakenly thrown into the world of African Americans. Oh, no. Big no. It's not the same an African American, community, and then sometimes, they are, there's a Nigerian community, and they say, oh, all of you are black, So they put them together in one community. Doesn't work that way. Doesn't work that way. There are a lot of conflicts. And you know why that happens? Because we do not know our cultural diversity, because we do not know our own reality. So we need to know that. We need to know these things. So other ethnic background, immigrants, Catholics from Africa, a large number of Catholics fleeing from the Middle East, from Iran, from Iraq, most of this Syria, a lot of them, a lot of Catholics migrating from the former Soviet Union. So you have about 10% altogether. African American, 3.6%. 3.6% of all Catholics. Now, these statistics vary. Sometimes they say 4%, 3.9, 3.7. But for the sake of argument, we're going to stick to 3.6%. Then Asian or Asian American, another largely diverse group. So here we have Chinese, Korean Catholics, Filipino Catholics. So 3.9%. Asian and Asian American Catholics are the fastest growing group in the Catholic Church. The fastest growing group. Now, we don't see the impact of that growth yet, because their numbers are very small. Numbers are very small. but we are beginning to see it. For instance, in certain parts of the country. The Diocese of Orange, California, for instance, recently ordained, I believe, two or three men to the priesthood, all of them Vietnamese, you know, and that's beginning to change. It's beginning to change in many places. And finally, Native Americans, small number, 0.7. By 2020, Latinas will constitute about 50% of the Catholic population in the United States. So you see, this is the diversity within which we are. I'm not going to get into Catholic schools yet, but the homework that I want to give you is, if you are able to do the stats for your schools right now, you know, maybe this is something you can do between 9 and 5 in the morning, you know, so just to see how the statistics in terms of ethnicity in your own schools match this, you know. That's one way of looking at how Catholic schools, you know, are responding or are being shaped or not being shaped, transformed by this reality. Look at the number of administrators and teachers in your Catholic schools. How many are Latinos? How many are African Americans? How many are Asian Americans? It would be interesting if you have, you know, Catholics who were born outside of the United States, you know. So there are millions and millions of Catholics born outside of the United States. Are they on staff? Are they serving in one way or another as administrators or teachers? Are they in your schools as students? That's a question that we need to start asking as we start responding. And actually, that was one of the purposes of your invitation to give this particular workshop. You know, the LaSallian brothers and the LaSallian community in the community of LaSallian schools wants to reflect about how, in the midst of this world of cultural diversity that we are describing right here, how we can respond as LaSallian schools. You know, how are our schools equipped, and if they are not, how can we equip them to respond to this particular reality? So, Catholicism in the 21st century is shaped, or will be shaped, profoundly by cultural diversity. Even more than what we have right now. It'll be an interesting experience. The question for you and me is, where do we stand in this conversation? Will this cultural diversity shape the way I run a school? Will it shape the way I write curriculum? Will it shape the way I teach? Will it shape the way I hire? Will it shape the way we recruit students to be in their classes? And Catholic educators are called to be responsive, meaning we cannot remain, you know, just with our hands tied, but we have to respond, we have to react in one way or another, and responsible. Catholic educators are called to be responsible. It is becoming an ethical call for all of us, an ethical call to use our institutions as instruments, as bridges to respond to the reality of cultural diversity in the church in the United States. So, this is my last point. The bishops of the United States and many other scholars have been working on different conversations based on this reality. And they are saying, now that we know more about the reality, we need to do something. But goodwill is not enough. No? We cannot do, actually, this is one of my biggest fights with parishes, you know? Because in parishes, sometimes they want to honor multiculturalism or cultural diversity. So they do the international fair, you know? So Latinos bring the tacos, no? The Asians or the Vietnamese bring the spring rolls. The Americans or the white community brings the hot dogs and the burgers, you know? And then you bring all people together, and sure, everybody eats everything, and then the rest of the year, nobody talks to each other, you know? So how can we move beyond this whole idea of tokenism in regards to cultural diversity? And it can happen in our schools. I know that there are international fairs or International Day in our schools, and we celebrate the Martin Luther King Day, and the African American History Month and the Hispanic History Month. But what happens the rest of the year? You know, what happens the rest of the year? So it seems like we are now being challenged to say the context has changed. We are the ground on which we stand is calling us for some particular commitments. So these scholars like Robert Schreider, for instance, Eddie Fernandez, Virgilio Elizondo, the Conference of Bishops, Alan Figueroa Deck, and some others are saying we need to develop leadership. We need to develop leadership at all levels. Administrators, in the context of Catholic schools, administrators, teachers, campus ministers, and not only teachers of theology, you know. Imagine if a teacher of history takes what I am saying and takes it at heart and makes it a point to teach, you know, diversity in a history course. So Latinos are not a footnote anymore, you see? Imagine literature, you know. Instead of teaching only Shakespeare, of course we need to read Shakespeare. But what about reading some of the best African American writers? What about reading some of the best Latina writers, Asian American writers in literature, and so forth? So we need leaders who move our institutions forward to respond to cultural diversity. And as I was saying, goodwill is not enough. Goodwill is not enough. It's not, and neither is winging it, you know? So sometimes we say, oh, sure, we'll do a little thing here or there, you know? Let's throw in a couple of words in Spanish or a song in Spanish, and then, you know, we'll fix it, no? But that's not enough. That's not enough. So if we need leaders to move us to the next stage in responding to cultural diversity, and here I'm not speaking about only white leaders learning about Latinos and African Americans. Here I'm speaking about African Americans engaging the Latina community and the Anglo community and the Native American community, and Latinos learning about all these communities. Everybody, this is for everybody, for all of us, immigrants, native-born, different races and ethnicities. So we need to develop intercultural competencies. What's an intercultural competence? An intercultural competence is the capacity to communicate, relate, and work across cultural boundaries. It involves developing capacity in 3 areas: knowledge, skills, and attitudes. Don't worry about this definition because we'll start tomorrow with it, okay? So, let's stop here. Say 3 or 4 of you, what do you take from this presentation? What caught your attention? What questions has it raised for you? What are your thoughts at this point? Excuse me? Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Oh, I thought. Anybody else?
Inherently, I'm not theology. That's not my history. But I guess I'm curious from the rest of you all, this notion of other types of theology, like Latino theology, the Asian theology, that's sort of a very new concept to me. And I guess I'd like to hear some of our people talk about their level of awareness or understanding or recognition of that, and how that plays out in our schools or doesn't play out. And it's really more of a conversation. It's not an indictment. It's just, that really struck me as something I had not heard of before.
We spend a lot of time with the seniors using liberation theology, which I think came out of the whole
That's right. So mostly from Latin
Spanish.
America.
Yeah,
No?
that's
Yeah.
But that's the 60s, 70s with Ferrer
Right.
and stuff. So.
Right. So, and that's part of it. For instance, a lot of curriculum actually engages liberation theology from Latin America, sometimes a little bit from Asia, Korean, Minjung theology, and so forth. But the question is that largely unknown is the work of U.S. Latina theologians, Asian American theologians, African American Catholic theologians. That's largely unknown. I don't know if anyone, does anyone here engages these conversations with your students? Okay. Good, that's point number one for curriculum. Yeah, thank you for raising the question. Any other observations, thoughts, comments?
I was interested when you shared the presentation of growth of the church and what will make up the church, the different ethnicities. Just shows how diverse it is versus what I
Absolutely. Thank you.
I'm going to go again to the comment I made regarding youth, the teens in our case, and conversations I've been having with pastors in our community in terms of the very vocabulary, the images that the students are presented with in the gospel, agrarian concepts. Many of these, many of the premises are things that we as adults have difficulty relating to. I look around in mass and I'm amazed that any of these kids show up and that they're trying to pay attention at all. And it seems to me that part of what you're saying in terms of the cultural diversity is that we bring our own preconceptions, our own assumptions, and they can blind us to the other contexts or assumptions that people bring. And part of what we're doing is trying to find a vocabulary, trying to relate. And in doing that and teaching that overtly in our curricula, actually helping our students to avoid repeating those mistakes as well.
Absolutely. And I think that since, for instance, one of the discussions in which you are engaging about implementing the curriculum, that's coming from the curricular guidelines coming from the USCCB, that's a question that needs to happen. And to be honest with you, I don't know how much room there is in there. We want our students to know about transubstantiation, sure, but how do you explain that to this particular culture? Thank you. One last point who wants to close?
There are so many different aspects of diversity. I've always tried to embrace diversity and try different things, but as I'm listening to your presentation, I honestly took a step back and said to myself, all I'm doing is this tokenism that you're talking about. And I'm really intrigued about, is it possible to have true intercultural competence when there is so much diversity?
That's absolute, when there is so much diversity. And as we will see, at the end of the day, an intercultural competence becomes like the lens through which we look at reality rather than actual exercises. It's like, for instance, me, cultural competency. Without the glasses, I can barely recognize your faces, But it's when I put on this, when I develop these cultural competencies, I may not know exactly who you are individually or the dynamics that occur in the different groups, but at least I know that you exist. And it's the awareness, because awareness leads to sensitivity, and sensitivity leads to action. But we'll get to those tomorrow. Thank you very much. So let's stop.
I hope that is a sign that you think our beginning here this evening is on point. And so we thank you, Professor Ospino, to getting us started to provide this broad overview, this context that is important to move us forward. So we're going to now decrease. So if you would just bear for 39 seconds or whatever, we're going to have our social stuff rolled into the room. So please make yourselves at home and enjoyable.